Welcome to Thinking Deeper by 6-7. Usually when we talk about human anatomy, we think of it like, I don't know, architecture, like a finished building. You reach adulthood, the scaffolding comes down, and your brain is essentially this static, concrete structure.
Right, the finished product.
Exactly. But right now, literally as you listen to my voice, the physical architecture of your brain is actively changing its shape.
Yeah.
So the core premise of today's deep dive is going to completely shatter that illusion of a fixed mind. Every single day, your daily habits, your quietest struggles, and especially your stress levels are physically remodeling your neural circuitry.
Yeah, we're looking at a biological system that is perpetually under construction. I mean, the adult brain never actually finishes developing. It responds to whatever sensory input you feed it. And it optimizes its own physical form for whatever environment you force it to navigate, whether that environment is, healthy or highly toxic.
And to understand exactly how this works, we are pulling from two incredible sources today. We've got the research notes from Dr. Laura Boyd. She's a leading brain researcher who focuses on the mechanics of neuroplasticity. And we've paired that with a really rigorous educational breakdown of the neurobiology of chronic stress.
It's a great combination of sources.
It really is. Our mission here is to basically hand you the biological user manual for your own mind. We will reveal how you can seize control of this physical evolution. And just a quick housekeeping note before we jump into the biology. If you like my channel, please subscribe and press the like button. Okay, let's unpack this. Before we look at how something like chronic stress tears the brain down, we have to understand the mechanics of how the brain builds itself up in the first place, right? We're talking about neuroplasticity.
Right, and to really grasp neuroplasticity, we have to look past this old prevailing medical dogma. For decades, the assumption was that, well, beyond childhood, the only major physical change your brain experienced was decay.
Just a slow decline.
Exactly, losing neurons to aging or trauma. But Dr. Boyd's research shows that learning actually forces the brain to change in three distinct interconnected ways. And those are chemically, structurally, and functionally.
I want to break these down because it's not just one magical process, right?
Yeah.
It's three different levels of construction happening simultaneously. So let's start with the chemical changes.
Sure. So chemical change is your brain's immediate short-term response to a new stimulus. Neurons, your brain cells, they don't actually touch each other. They communicate by firing chemical signals across a tiny gap called a synapse.
Okay.
When you first start learning something new, your brain simply increases the concentration of those chemical signals in the relevant pathways. It just floods the gap.
Just pumps it full of chemical.
Right. And this happens incredibly fast, which is why it supports short-term memory or, an immediate improvement in a motor skill.
I've actually always thought about this kind of rapid learning, like trying to master a new song on the piano. You sit down, you practice this difficult chord progression for an hour, and suddenly you nail it. Your fingers know exactly where to go.
Yeah, you get that aha moment.
Right. You think, I've got it. But then you wake up the next day, you sit at the piano, and your hands are completely lost again. It's like you never practiced.
Well, let's take that analogy a step further. Flooding the synapse with chemicals is cheap and easy for the body, but it's highly temporary. It's essentially writing a reminder on a Post-it note.
A Post-it note, wow.
Yeah. You lost your piano progress overnight because those rapid chemical changes didn't cross the threshold to trigger the second type of neuroplasticity, which is structural change.
So the brain essentially decides that the piano chord just wasn't important enough to keep. But why doesn't the brain just make everything permanent right away? Like, why not just build the structure immediately?
Well, because structural change requires actual physical cellular mass. And the human brain is a massive energy hog. I mean, it accounts for a huge percentage of your daily caloric burn.
Right, it's expensive to run.
Exactly. Your biology isn't going to invest the precious energy to physically manufacture new proteins or sprout new neural branches and pour a permanent concrete foundation unless it absolutely has to.
That makes sense.
Structural change alters the actual physical architecture of the brain to support long-term memory. It takes sustained repetition to force the brain's hand.
And the physical evidence of this in the source material is absolutely wild. Like when we say the brain changes structure, we mean it literally expands its real estate. The notes mention these studies on Braille readers.
Oh, yeah, those are fascinating.
Right. When neuroscientists scan the brains of people who read Braille, the physical sensory area in the brain dedicated to their reading hand is measurably larger than in people who don't read Braille.
It physically reallocates cortical real estate. And we see the exact same phenomenon in London taxi drivers. To get their license, they have to pass this test called the knowledge.
Which is brutally difficult from what I hear.
Oh, it's incredibly tough. It requires memorizing a massive, super complex map of the city's labyrinth of streets. And brain scans show that the hippocampus, which is the area heavily involved in spatial memory, is visibly larger in these drivers compared to the general public.
It's literally swelling. So the brain is building physical mass in the areas that are forced to work the hardest. And I guess that leads to the third type of change, functional plasticity.
Yeah, functional change is the macro level. This is where entire brain networks shift their behavior. As you continuously use a specific brain region, that region becomes increasingly excitable. The baseline threshold for activating it drops.
So it's easier to trigger.
Precisely. Ultimately, the brain reorganizes its entire network of electrical activity based on which pathways are heavily trafficked and which are just abandoned.
Which brings us to a rather unsettling realization, I think. If our brains constantly map to our daily behaviors, neuroplasticity is completely agnostic.
Highly agnostic.
It doesn't care if what you're doing is actually good for you.
Yeah.
So what happens if your primary daily experience isn't something productive, like learning Braille or navigating London, but just dealing with relentless, suffocating stress?
Well, you trigger the exact same biological mechanisms, but they work against you. The brain doesn't judge the behavior, it just optimizes for it. If you feed your system constant stress, your neurobiology will physically rebuild itself to be highly efficient at being stressed.
Wait, but isn't stress sometimes a good thing? Like, athletes thrive on high stress.
Right.
Business leaders, performers, they use that intense burst of energy and focus to excel. So where's the actual biological line between this stress is a performance enhancer that helps me win, and this stress is literally melting my prefrontal cortexes?
That is a great question, and that line is drawn by time. Short-term, acute stress is a highly effective evolutionary survival tool. If a lion jumps out of the brush, you need a massive, immediate spike in energy to run away.
Right, you don't want to be relaxed in that moment.
Exactly. And what's fascinating here is the danger arises when we look at chronic stress.
Yeah.
The modern, everyday psychological pressures like, financial worry, toxic workplaces, or endless social media outrage. To understand the damage there, we have to look at how the brain communicates with the body through the HPA axis.
Right, and the sources define the HPA axis as the hypothalamus, the
Yeah.
pituitary gland, and the adrenal glands. But instead of just listing the anatomy, let's look at what this actually does. When you get stressed, your brain essentially hits the panic button on this HPA axis. It's this chemical highway that runs straight from the center of your brain down to the adrenal glands sitting on top of your kidneys. And those glands instantly dump a hormone called cortisol into your bloodstream.
And cortisol acts as a chemical override switch for your entire biological system. Think about it. In a survival situation, your body doesn't need to digest lunch or fight off a mild cold or engage in complex philosophical thought.
You just need to survive the next 5 minutes.
Right. Cortisol shuts down those non-essential systems and routes all available power to your muscles and your survival reflexes.
Which is brilliant if you are running from a predator for 10 minutes. But if you are stressed about your mortgage for 10 months, that system never turns off.
And prolonged exposure to high levels of cortisol is fundamentally toxic to the brain's delicate architecture. We see terrifying structural changes. Let's look at the amygdala, for instance.
A fear center.
Exactly. It's essentially the brain's threat detection center. Chronic elevated cortisol acts like a steroid for the amygdala. It increases both the number of neural connections and the overall electrical activity in that region.
So the fear center is getting the London taxi driver treatment. Because you are constantly stressed, the brain assumes you live in an active war zone. So it dedicates more physical real estate to processing fear.
You are structurally training your brain to perceive threats even when there are none. You're jumpy all the time. But the biological cost of expanding the amygdala is profound because at the exact same time, high cortisol levels are actively destroying the hippocampus.
The hippocampus is the area crucial for learning and memory. The sources say stress severely deteriorates the electrical signals in the hippocampus. But what is the actual mechanism there? Like, how does a hormone destroy an electrical signal?
It basically comes down to overstimulation. Cortisol causes the neurons in the hippocampus to absorb way too much calcium. This overexcites the cells to the point where they literally burn out and die.
Wow.
It's a process called excitotoxicity. The physical synaptic connections just wither away.
Which perfectly explains why, when you were going through a period of intense chronic stress, you just start dropping the ball. You forget small details. You misplace your keys. You can't seem to retain new information in a meeting. Your memory center is physically degrading.
Yes, but the truly insidious part of this mechanism is that the hippocampus serves a dual purpose. Yes, it handles memory, but it is also the part of the brain responsible for inhibiting the HPA axis. It is the biological brake pedal.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, when a stressful event ends, the hippocampus is supposed to signal the hypothalamus to stop producing cortisol.
Oh, I see the loop. The cortisol melts the brake pedal, which means the hippocampus can't shut off the HPA axis, which dumps more cortisol into the system, which causes even more excitotoxicity in the hippocampus. The car just keeps accelerating.
It is a completely runaway biological feedback loop, and the structural degradation doesn't stop at memory. Cortisol causes a massive loss of synaptic connections in the prefrontal cortex as well.
That's the part right behind your forehead, right?
Okay. Right. The region responsible for high-level executive functions, deep concentration, complex decision-making, emotional regulation, and social judgment. As those connections are severed, the prefrontal cortex literally shrinks in mass.
So chronic stress is quite literally eroding the very biological structures that make us capable of complex, rational human thought. I mean, that physical shrinking is alarming enough, but looking at the sources, there's an even deeper microscopic layer of change here. Stress isn't just severing our neural connections, it's altering us at the genetic level through epigenetics.
Epigenetics is where this science becomes highly consequential. Now, we need to be clear here. Your DNA sequence, the actual biological code you inherited from your parents, that does not mutate or change because of stress.
Right, the code itself stays the same.
But epigenetics determines how that code is expressed. Your DNA is wrapped around these proteins called histones. Epigenetic markers, like these chemical tags called methyl groups, can physically attach to the DNA and wrap it so tightly that your cellular machinery literally cannot read the genes.
So the code for a healthy, stress-resilient brain might still be there in your DNA, but the stress has added chemical padlocks to it. The builders can't open the blueprint.
That's a great way to put it.
And the sources detail this incredible experiment with mother rats and their pups that perfectly illustrates how deeply this affects behavior.
Oh, the mother rat study. That is a cornerstone in epigenetic behavioral research. Scientists observed two distinct types of mother rats. There were those who were highly nurturing, they frequently licked and groomed their newborns, and those who were neglectful and distant.
Okay.
They discovered that the physical act of grooming triggered a biochemical cascade in the pups that actually removed those restrictive epigenetic tags from specific genes.
And the result of removing those tags was that the nurtured pups developed significantly more cortisol receptors in their brains. Now, intuitively, you might think that if cortisol is the stress hormone, having more receptors for it would be a bad thing.
Yeah, it's a super common misconception, but the biology works in the exact opposite way here. Think back to the hippocampus acting as the brake pedal.
Right.
Because the nurtured pups had more cortisol receptors, their brains were incredibly sensitive at detecting cortisol in the bloodstream. So the moment stress levels began to rise, their highly tuned system recognized it immediately and slammed on the brakes.
Just shutting down the HPA axis right away.
Exactly.
So their baseline state was calm, and they recovered from stress almost instantly. They were biologically armored.
Conversely, the pups raised by neglectful mothers kept those restrictive epigenetic tags. They developed far fewer cortisol receptors.
So their brakes didn't work.
Right. Their brains couldn't detect the cortisol efficiently, so the internal alarm bell just kept ringing. Their HPA axis stayed flooded. As a result, they grew up to be highly anxious, easily overwhelmed, and deeply vulnerable to stress throughout their entire adult lives.
Here's where it gets really interesting, though. The twist in the source material isn't just about that one single generation of rats. The researchers discovered that these epigenetic changes, the heightened anxiety and stress vulnerability from the neglectful mothers, were passed down to multiple future generations of rats.
Yeah, the physical trauma of that early environment became biologically heritable. Even if the subsequent generations were raised in peaceful environments, they were born with the epigenetic padlocks already in place.
Which forces a massive, uncomfortable question. If stress can write itself into our genetic expression without our permission, are we just biologically doomed by the trauma of our parents?
That's a heavy thought.
Like if my parents or grandparents lived through chronic, debilitating stress, am I just genetically hardwired to have a shrinking prefrontal cortex and a broken HPA axis?
That is the terrifying implication, yes, but the answer is no. You are not a victim of your biology. And this brings us right back to the foundational principle of neuroplasticity.
Because it's reversible.
Exactly. Because the brain and the epigenome are so highly plastic, these negative structural and chemical changes are largely reversible. The exact same mechanisms that allow chronic stress to tear the brain down allow you to actively rebuild it.
Okay, so how do we become the architects of our own brains? If neuroplasticity is constantly happening, how much deliberate effort does it take to overwrite a stressed system? I mean, there's that incredibly famous Malcolm Gladwell rule everyone cites, the 10,000 hours to master a skill rule. Is rewiring our brain really just a simple math equation?
You mean just logging the hours?
Yeah. Do I just need to grind out 10,000 hours of meditation to undo a stressful childhood?
Not at all. Dr. Boyd's research vehemently rejects the 10,000-hour rule. The idea that there is this flat universal equation for neuroplasticity completely ignores the reality of human biology. Every single brain is utterly unique.
Because of different life experiences.
Right, shaped by a lifetime of different environmental inputs, genetics, and structural foundations. What takes one person 10 hours of deliberate practice to permanently wire into their brain might take another person 10,000 hours.
So we can't just punch a clock and expect our hippocampus to grow back.
Exactly. Dr. Boyd advocates for a paradigm shift toward personalized learning. The analogy she uses is ontology. We don't just give a generic one-size-fits-all chemotherapy to every cancer patient anymore, right?
It's tailored.
We practice personalized medicine, matching highly specific treatments to the unique genetic markers of a specific tumor. Because our brains are infinitely more complex, there is no universal neuroplasticity pill. We have to tailor our behavioral interventions to our own unique biological baselines.
But even without a universal prescription, the sources do give us some heavily researched, concrete tools to start reversing the specific damage of chronic stress right now.
I'm looking at the notes on exercise and meditation here, and the fascinating part is that the research doesn't just say they, calm you down. It says they are literally structural antidotes.
They are. Both cardiovascular exercise and mindfulness meditation require deep, regulated breathing and intense environmental or internal awareness. What this does on a biological level is actively suppress the HPA axis, halting the flow of cortisol.
It puts a stop to the override switch. Exactly. But more importantly, sustained practice of both exercise and meditation has been shown in MRI scans to physically grow the volume of the hippocampus.
They're literally adding dense cellular mass back to the memory and stress control center. You are structurally rebuilding the very brake pedal that the cortisol melted away.
You are reversing the excitotoxicity. It's incredible. But mitigating stress is only half the battle. What about actively driving new learning? The source material dives into stroke recovery, looking at patients who have suffered catastrophic brain damage and are trying to force their brains to rewire entirely new pathways to regain motor control.
And what's the catalyst for that kind of extreme structural change? Like, how do you force the brain to spend the massive caloric energy required to pour new concrete?
The primary driver of structural neuroplasticity is behavior, but specifically the intense struggle of that behavior.
The struggle.
Yes. Dr. Boyd's data shows that passive repetition just doesn't work. The brain will simply use its existing highly efficient chemical pathways. To force structural change, you have to push the brain to the point of failure. The periods of intense difficulty, frustration, and struggle during practice are the biological triggers.
That completely reframes the entire concept of learning. When you are trying to learn a new language or a complex software program at work, and you feel entirely frustrated and exhausted, that friction isn't a sign that you are failing or that you aren't smart enough. That friction is the mandatory biological signal your brain requires to justify the caloric expenditure of building new physical pathways.
The brain is ruthlessly efficient. It will not alter its physical architecture unless you prove to it that the current architecture is completely inadequate for the task at hand. You have to lean into the cognitive difficulty.
So what does this all mean? If we distill all of this complex biology down, the ultimate takeaway is a profound sense of accountability. Your brain is not a static object you were handed at birth. It is a living, breathing record of your daily existence.
Absolutely.
It is constantly being shaped by what you do, and equally by what you don't do. Every single hour spent passively doom scrolling, every chronic stressor you just try to ignore, is actively carving toxic pathways into your neural architecture and shrinking your prefrontal cortex.
You hold the architectural plans.
Right. You have the power to protect your executive function by managing your HPA axis with deliberate exercise and meditation. And you have the power to build a profoundly capable mind, by seeking out the friction and struggle of learning hard things.
And that is the most empowering realization in modern neuroscience.
Yeah.
When you take your headphones off after this deep dive, your brain will physically not be the exact same structure it was when you started listening.
That's crazy to think about.
It is. The intense act of processing this dense information, of visualizing synapses and epigenetic tags, has already altered your neurochemistry. The invitation here is to stop being a passive recipient of whatever environment you happen to be in, and to go out and actively, deliberately engineer the brain you want.
It fundamentally changes how you view your own agency. But, parsing through all this research also leaves me with a pretty unsettling, lingering thought.
What's that?
Well, if our brains are physically molded by every single sensory input we interact with, and we know for a fact that chronic low-grade stress slowly melts our higher cognitive functions and expands our fear centers, how is our modern technological environment silently rewiring our species?
Oh, wow.
Right. With the constant digital microstressors, the algorithmic outrage, the endless notifications, and the fragmented 247 streams of information demanding our attention, are we accidentally pouring the concrete for a human race whose baseline neurobiology is permanently anxious, reactive, and completely unable to focus? Something to think about the next time your phone buzzes. Until next time, keep thinking deeper.